Hello and welcome to This Week in the Garden. For this week's episode, we're going to talk about one of my favorites and probably a lot of y'all's favorites, and that's sweet corn. Now, we're going to talk about some of the things that might go wrong with your sweet corn plantings now that we're getting close to harvest. Maybe some of you have already started to pick your sweet corn. And we're going to talk about some of the things that I've seen in my garden as well, starting really from the beginning with germination. So if you've had issues with germination, what it's going to look like is kind of only a few plants are coming up or they're not coming up at the same time. And that's kind of what we've seen here in some of my earlier variety corn. Now, the ways that you can get around this are to make sure that you're watering your corn every day, depending on how much rain you're getting, but they need to stay moist. That way the roots don't dry up when they're young. Another thing you can do is make sure that the soil temperatures are warm before you start planting. You need about 65 degrees for sweet corn, and the sweeter your sweet corn variety, the warmer the soil has to be. So keep that in mind. Don't plant too early for your sweet corn. And then the next thing is planting depth. You want your plants to emerge at the same time, and we'll talk about why in a few minutes, but you want to make sure that you're planting all of your corn seeds at the same depth. For me, that's about 1 inch, so I use my knuckle. So my first knuckle on my index finger, I put that down in the soil, and then I get the same depth for all of my corn, and that works pretty well. So that's germination problems. After your plants have come up, the next thing you might see is wind damage, and that's when your plants blow over easy to the wind. Now, we get a lot of wind in this area, so sometimes it's not going to be your fault. You just get a really windy storm and your corn's going to blow over. But if your corn is consistently blowing over every day, there might be some things that you can do about it. The first thing is look at the soil type. If it's a really sandy soil, your corn is going to be more likely to blow over because the roots don't have much to hold on to. And so if you have sandy soil, try to mix in some more organic material, whether that's some type of heavier clay or heavier topsoil in with where you're going to plant your corn. The other reason might be that you planted your corn seedlings too shallow, and that's what happened to me. I planted them in an area that the soil kind of stays wet, and because some of my seeds weren't that inch deep, the roots were shallower. And then another thing I did wrong was I added too much water. So you don't have to water your corn plants very much once they've come up. You can kind of reduce that back to once or twice a week for your waterings. If you overwater your corn, and this is really any of your vegetable plants, there's going to be too much water, so the roots aren't going to dig down deep and search for that water. They're going to be kind of on the surface, and that's what happened for my corn. I'm going to try to show you all some that blew over, and hopefully you'll be able to see around the roots. They're not quite as big as we would expect for sweet corn. Now, the next thing after you've had that, maybe your corn is starting to tassel and you're realizing some of your corn is shorter than normal. And that's something that we've seen over the county this year, and there's a number of reasons why that might be. The first is just your variety. So if we look at the corn right in front of me, that's a 60-day variety. It just doesn't get very tall. Usually your 70 and 80-day variety corns are going to be taller, and that's the stuff behind me. Those are 70 and 80 days. So they're much taller. They're about 7 to 8 feet tall. But if you have earlier varieties, they're not going to grow quite as tall. Another thing is cool temperatures. Corn likes warm temperatures, and so if you have cool weather like we've had this year, it's not going to get quite as tall. And then probably the last thing is your nutrients. If you don't get enough nitrogen out on your corn, it's not going to be quite as tall as it normally would. And what we recommend and what our production guide says is to put out 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Now, in a small garden plot, it's not nearly 200 pounds. I put out a couple pounds of nitrogen on this. But when we have a year like this where we've got a lot of rain, that water is going to wash away the nitrogen, so you're going to have to put out more nitrogen than just what you put out at planting. And so that can be another reason why your corn is short. Now, once we've gotten through tasseling, the next thing is harvesting your corn. And this is probably something people have seen when you go to pick your ears. You open them up, and then it doesn't look like the kernels have filled all the way out, whether they're not filled to the tip or they're irregular size. That's due to poor pollination. And there's really two main reasons that can happen. The first is that you don't have enough corn. And so if we look at my early variety here, I don't have very many corn plants that are tasseling at the same time, and so I'm likely to have poor pollination issues. Now, I do have some corn varieties behind me, so there's a chance that they'll cross-pollinate, so that might save my corn here. But you want to have a handful of good rows. You always want to plant your corn in rows because it's pollinated by the wind. And so these pollen are going to blow down from the tops of the plants onto the silks, and that's how you'll get your pollination. The other reason you might have poor pollination is heat. So you want to try to avoid having your corn pollinating in the hottest parts of the summer. So that's going to be really this time of year, early July, late June, and then really throughout July. The ways that you can get around that are by controlling the planting date. So when do you plant your corn? Maybe you want it to plant it a little bit earlier so it's maturing earlier, or you want to hold off and plant it a little bit later. This is one of those things that's kind of hard to control, but might be an explanation if you usually have good years and then one year you have a bad year. Could be because of the hot weather. So now the last thing, you've opened up your corn, you're ready to eat it, and you notice that it tastes really not that sweet. And there's a number of reasons. Most people point straight to the variety and they say, well, this is just a bad variety or bad corn. And that could be the case. There's really three main types of corn. There's a standard, there's a super sweet, and then there's another variety that's kind of in between. And I'll put more information on those kind of in our article description so you can check those out. But if you're maybe not happy with your variety, try a sweeter or super sweet variety corn. That might help. Another thing that might be a problem is if your cornfield is by field corn. So field corn will cross-pollinate with sweet corn and it'll make it kind of starchier, not as sweet. And then the last thing that might make your corn kind of tougher is when you're harvesting. So a lot of people, and myself included, will go out and pick corn right before dinner because that's the freshest corn that you're going to get right before you eat. But if you pick your corn in the afternoon, the corn has lost a lot of water because of the heat, and so it's not going to be quite as sweet. It's going to be a little bit starchier. So you want to make sure that you're picking your corn in the morning, and then you're going to get it cooled down, and that'll help to keep the sugars in the corn cob. So that's really what you can do to make your corn a little bit sweeter. We've got another video from, I think it was last week, where we talked about harvest. So take a look at that and you can know when your plants are mature, when's the best time to pick your vegetables. But that's all we have for this week's episode from This Week in the Garden. If you have any questions, let us know, type them in the forum or shoot me an email. And of course, make sure that you stay tuned for next time from This Week in the Garden.